Okay. Thank you for being with us today. Today's panelists are three of the primary architects of criminal justice reform, here to speak with you today about COVID and incarceration, what we have learned, and I should add, where we should go from here. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will have a question for each, followed by an exchange among the speakers themselves and questions from the audience. I'll introduce each speaker in the order of appearance: Mark Osler, Alice Marie Johnson, and Professor Rachel Barkow. Welcome to you all. We're honored by your presence and so glad you're here. Mark Osler is Vice President of the Braxton Institute and heads our initiative on clemency, prison reform, and death penalty abolition. He's been our signatory on several petitions for related legislation. Mark is Robert and Marion Short Distinguished Chair at the University of St. Thomas Law School, where he teaches crime punishment and restorative justice, among other topics. He's also served as the head of the Association of Religiously Affiliated Law Schools, and he's the only lawyer I know who has a preaching chair in his church. He's also an amazing father. He and Ann Lewis Osler, a historian, are the loving parents of Micah, John Osler III, and Luke. And to this we add, congratulations, John, on your graduation from Grinnell University this week. We expect great things of you. And of course, we congratulate Mark on that as well. So thank you so much for all you do for the Institute, Mark, and all you do for criminal justice reform. Alice Marie Johnson is also an American criminal justice reform advocate and a former federal prisoner. She was convicted in 1996 for her involvement in a Memphis cocaine trafficking organization and sentenced to life imprisonment. She received clemency in 2017 while serving that life sentence and was ordained while in prison to Christian ministry, serving the prison population as a pastoral caregiver and a hospice chaplain. Alice Marie Johnson can teach us much about criminal justice reform, and she can also teach us much about isolation. We're expecting an encouraging word from her. And for more, because you won't have enough of Alice Marie Johnson after we're done with our webinar today, I recommend her autobiography, Life After Life, which is available on Kindle and as an audiobook. Welcome, Alice. Rachel Barkow is Vice Dean and Siegel Family Professor of Regulatory Law and Policy and Faculty Director of the Center for Administration of Criminal Law at the New York University School of Law. Among other things, she was Justice Scalia's counterclerk, a progressive voice in conservative chambers. She also clerked for Judge Lawrence H. Silberman, U.S. Court of Appeals, District Court, D.C., and she must have done a pretty good job because he officiated her wedding. Rachel is the author of an influential book, Prisoner of Politics, Breaking the Cycles of Mass Incarceration, published last year, and she is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, quite possibly the nation's leading data-side expert on over-incarceration. Welcome, Rachel, and thank you for making time for us today to join our community dialogue. I would like to note that among the impressive list of publications from Rachel And from Mark, there is one that you co-authored, Restructuring Clemency, the Cost of Ignoring Clemency and a Plan for Renewal, which appeared in the University of Chicago Law Review some time ago. So you've been collaborators to great effect. You've gotten a lot of people out of prison. You've made great impact on policy. Please begin by teaching us what you've learned from COVID.
Well, good morning. It's morning here in Central Time anyways. And I'd like to start out by thanking you, Dr. Braxton. You've been my mentor for over 35 years now, since I was a college student. And it's great to be in the company of many of the people here who have been involved in what we're going to be talking about. Rachel, Alice, Nkechi, Taifa, of course, is one of the people who pulled me into this whole thing, and I always appreciate that. I'm going to be brief so that we can get to the others and have plenty of time to hear their perspective. But I do want to say just a couple significant things about what we're seeing in the last few months. One is that we have seen a reduction in jail and prison populations, and particularly in some jails, that has been really dramatic. Here in Minnesota, in Ramsey County, which is St. Paul, and in Hennepin County, which is Minneapolis, you've had a reduction of 25% to a third. In Duluth, the St. Louis County, north of here, you've had a reduction by half, by 50% in the jail population. And the important thing to see in this is that we've let people out of jail and crime has not gone up. That is a lasting lesson going forward about how we can approach the people that we incarcerate and review the need to incarcerate so many people, particularly before trial. The second thing that I think we've learned so far in this time of confusion and trouble is we've seen the shocking timidity of some of our leaders. I think Rachel certainly is going to talk about this some, I expect. But we've seen some people who have shown real leadership and others that have sorely disappointed us as we've seen people die in prison unnecessarily. One thing that's consistent with what we've learned in the past too is that some of those who disappoint us are heroes in other areas, and that we have to be able to let go of some of our preconceptions. When the governor of Oklahoma grants over 400 commutations and the governor of New York grants 0, we're looking at something that may confound some of our expectations. The third thing is that we are in a time where storytelling is going to be essential. And this is where people like Alice are so important, is that most people aren't hearing enough about what's going on inside, about what it's like to be in a confined space with a killer, which is the COVID virus. To people who are in places where their cellmates have died, where this fear adds to the other deprivations that those in prison and jail suffer. I get a lot of mail, and I'm getting a lot of mail right now from people in prison. And just this morning, I opened up a letter from a woman in Aliceville, the federal women's prison in Alabama, Angelia Miller, who's someone, Alice, who was in your choir with you in Aliceville. And part of what she wrote was this, that I've had a lot going on and I'm just in a crying stage. My son was shot at a gas station after fueling his truck. He's okay now, but he needs his mom and sister. My mother's 79 years old and sick, just got out of the hospital. I've had another grandbaby born and I missed her birth. And that's all in addition to the fear of COVID and the virus. She ends the letter by saying this, with God and a few helping hands, I can make it. And we need to be those helping hands going forward. And we need to, part of that help has to be to push those in power to make a difference and to thin out the populations in prison. So, Dr. Braxton, that's my opening statement. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I have been unmuted.
There you go. Okay.
It's a persuasive statement, Dr. Osler. Thank you so much. And let's move on to Alice Marie Johnson. What would you share with us today, Miss Alice?
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me on today. The thing that I think that is very important for those who are listening, for anyone who's listening or watching this, is that the people who are in prison, they literally don't have a voice unless we become their voices. Right now, they're in a place where it seems like the world is in isolation, and I, for one, know what that feels like to be in isolation, separated from your family, missing loved ones. But this has an added dimension to it, the fear. At least we who are free now, and I thank God every day that I am a free woman, but I know that I wasn't just set free for freedom's sake. I was set free for others also. So it's very important that I use my voice and continue to use my story for those who don't have a voice as I do. We have a responsibility, not just as a nation, but as human beings. We have a responsibility to look after. I'm going to use a phrase my mother used to use, to see about those who are
see about those.
To see about them. We got to see about them. And I know a lot of them are wondering, who is going to see about me? And they are not disposable. These are not disposable, where if because they have committed a crime, does not mean that their crime should become a death sentence. They're in a situation where they are totally helpless. They're dependent upon us to be their voices, to speak for them, to see about them, to fight for them, to bring their plight to the attention of those who are in power that can see about them. So I remember reading in Ezekiel 37, I think it's 1-4, the Lord asked Ezekiel, can these dry bones live? And he told Ezekiel to prophesy, to speak to them. That valley that those dry bones were in, these were literally, they had no breath in them, as the prisoners have no voice in them right now. Ezekiel had to use his voice to speak to those dry bones, and those dry bones came back to life again. We've got to be the Ezekiels. We've got to speak to this situation, to those dry bones, to those who are incarcerated, locked away, and seemingly forgotten. But we're making so much noise out here. We're using our voices to speak to them and say that you will live again, that you will come out of this. We owe this to them. So many are in there under unjust laws, from old laws that were put into place under the old war on drugs, that have them in a situation where they are spending way too much time. And as Mark said, as prisoners are being released, crime is not going up. People commit crimes, they rehabilitate, they paid their debt to society, yet we still hold them bound in that valley unnecessarily. And during this time, where a light is being shined because of COVID, so many of those who are free are experiencing what the prisoners experience on a daily basis, and that's isolation. Add to that the fear factor of this invisible killer, to see people around them who are dying, to see them not getting the help that they need. Can you just imagine what the families are going through? So many families are reaching out to me, asking me if there is anything that can be done. I've been using my voice, a platform that God has graced me with, that he has given me to make a whole lot of noise about this, to speak at every opportunity that please don't forget about the prisoners. You know, and I consider myself, I'm a woman of faith. And we know that the Lord is going to one day tell those who have did his will, who have visited those, who remembered those who are in prison, who fed the ones who had no food, who clothed those who had no clothes. He's going to say, you stand on my left who didn't do my will, and you stand on my right who did the things that I've commanded you to do. One thing he does not say is come sit on my lap, because there's no middle ground that you can take. You cannot stand in the middle and expect that what you did was okay. And by doing absolutely nothing, you are becoming a part of the problem. If you don't use your voice, and we do have a voice, those who have been elected into office, we are not their servants, they're our servants. They are servants of the people, and they listen to us. If we raise our voices loud enough, they will listen to us. But we can't sit back in silence and say that I'm only concerned about what is going on with me right now. I'm only concerned with what's going on with my family right now. You've got to be concerned, because these are your brothers, these are your sisters who are incarcerated. These are our family members. These are people who we love, and they've got loved ones out there who are terrified for them. So I would encourage, what we need to do, I believe, to answer the call, not only the call that God has called us to do, but the call as human beings. We have to answer the call and use our voices to speak up for them. Your voice might not be the same voice as mine, but you do have a voice. And you've got to let those who are in power know that this is a concern of yours, that the ones who are incarcerated, they still have value, they still have worth, they still have purpose. And these dead bones will live again. I know I don't want to take up
Thank
all
you.
of your time, because I could keep talking about this, because it is so close to my heart, because I'm not just talking about them. I'm one of them. Except for the grace of God, that would be me right now. I have not been free even 2 years. And there is not a day that I wake up that I don't think about those who I left behind. Because really and truly, I've got to fight for them. And if there are families who have family members who are incarcerated, I want you to know, from my lips to your ears, that I have not forgotten about them, and that I am fighting for them, and I will continue to use the position that I'm in. If I can speak to those who are in authority, that's exactly what I have been doing. If I can use my platform to tell their stories, because it's my story, to show my face, because when you see my face, you see their faces. And I won't stop until I see change has taken place.
You were also a change maker while you were incarcerated. And
Yep.
I love the story that you shared with me about the young woman who was always getting into difficulty because she laughed. Could you share that story just briefly with us, please, about that particular ministry in your church context while incarcerated?
When we're doing things, well, for me, my time in prison it wasn't that I ever thought anyone would even pay attention to the things. Who would have thought that I'd become a national figure and people would be reading my story or hearing anything about me? The things that I did in prison for the women there were the things, I call them things that we've all been called to do, and treat each other as human beings, treat each other the way we want to be treated. The story that I shared with you this morning, it was something that blessed me so much. And if anyone goes to my Facebook, she just sent me this message yesterday. Her name was Jamie Russell. And it was a young woman who she had over an 11-year sentence. And I met her. I'd seen her before around the compound, but it was just being kind to her when she showed up. When she came into church, I welcomed her. I got her involved in things that she could do. And I just showed her kindness, and I showed her the love of God. And she told me in her letter, she talked about gloves. When she first came, I invited her to become an usher in the church. And I told her that I would make sure she had the good gloves, that I saved her a pair of good gloves. And she wondered what that meant until the next Sunday at church. She saw everyone, it was communion, that was to serve communion. She saw everyone grasping to try to find gloves that matched. But I had a pair of good gloves for her. And I didn't even think that that would have such an impact on her, of just kindness, reaching out to her to be kind to her. But I also told her when she asked me how in the world I was able to have this peace about myself. And I told her that even though I'm physically, basically, even though I'm physically in prison, that you can't lock my spirit up, that my spirit has always been free. And she said that during count times, she'd often get in trouble for laughing so much. And the guards would ask her why she'd laugh so much. And she'd tell them, why are you laughing so much in prison? She said, I'm not in prison. He said, you're in prison. And she said that she's not in prison because her spirit is free. But she told me how that changed her life, and how people have asked her since she came home how she was able to survive 11 years in prison. And she says she tells everyone she meets that it was because of a woman who I met by the name of Alice Johnson. And I hear many, many stories like that, but it's not because I was trying to impress anyone. And it's not because I am trying to impress anyone now. I just believe in remembering people and treating them with kindness and the way that I want to be treated. And if I was in prison right now, I'd want someone to remember me and treat me with kindness by fighting for me.
Thank you. Thank you. I love this image of remembering, bringing the members back together, rejoining us with our constituent parts, with the parts of our human family, with seeing about one another, which begins with seeing each other and then seeing about each other. So thank you for being here with us today to see about us so that we might see and see about others. And thank you for that little sermon. It was a blessing. Rachel, again, I'm so honored to be among the architects of criminal justice reform, 3 of the great American architects of criminal justice reform today. In your book, Prisoners of Politics, subtitled Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration, you bring to our attention the fact that 1 in 3 adults in America now has a criminal record, and that we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. You also point out that releasing people has not impacted public safety, just as Mark has pointed out. And there's a tension between the need for change and the use of mandatory minimums, and for folks who want things to stay the way they are. You raise questions about race matters and judicial discretion. So please couch your comments today in some of the wonderful work that you've done, and tell us what we need to know about COVID and incarceration. Tell us something you've learned. Tell us something we need to know, and where we need to go from here.
Thank you. First, I just want to say what an honor it is to be with you, Dr. Braxton, and on this panel with Alice and Mark. This is a tough act to follow. I guess I want to emphasize a couple things. And unfortunately, after that wonderful, uplifting message by Alice, the first thing I want to emphasize is a little bit more depressing. And that's just how resistant mass incarceration is. And I think the number one thing I'm learning in this pandemic is that, because even in the face of a deadly virus where prisons and jails are the leading places in the United States for the spread of that virus, they are the top hotspots in America in terms of the rapid spread of this deadly virus, we still see people digging their heels in and saying, nope, we don't need to do anything differently. And, to me, that is something that should be on the front page of the paper every day. It should be something that we all call out as just absolutely wrong. And just to give you an example of what I mean, we have around the country, public health officials have been telling governors, have been telling prosecutors, have been telling corrections officials, you need to act now to get people out of prisons and jails, because you need it to not be crowded so that people can be appropriately spaced. You need to get them basic hygiene. They have to pay for soap in prisons. They don't have soap. They don't have access to hand sanitizer because corrections officials are afraid they're going to use the alcohol in some kind of way. I mean, it's a kind of alternative universe that's out there. And even though public health officials have said, you need to release people for their safety and for everyone's safety, because people work inside prisons and jails and they go home at night to their families and their communities, and they then spread the virus. So this is a kind of a health question for all of us, even if it wasn't just that basic humanity question. And so what has been so disheartening for me is that even with all that, we see people who say, no, we can't do it. We can't do anything differently. I'm going to file a motion when you ask to be released. And, I've seen these motions in court. Someone will file and say, this is a 70-year-old with emphysema who is asking to be released, and the government says, no, we can't let you out. That would be a public safety risk, they say. You need to serve the rest of your sentence, they say. And I think it's really important for us to look at this moment and really question the culture in some of these institutions, because I think sometimes there's undue deference given to law enforcement, that they really know best about public safety. And I think this should be showing all of us that actually they don't know much at all, because what we should be doing in the name of public safety right now is letting people out of prisons and jails. It's a no-brainer, but they're still resisting that. And I hope that one takeaway for all of us is that those folks don't have superior knowledge about these things. What they have are reflexive reactions to keeping people incarcerated, but they actually haven't looked at data. They haven't looked at evidence of what works for public safety. And if they had, absolutely, they would be doing mass releases right now. And as Mark said at the outset, in places where that's happened, and unfortunately they're few and far between, crime is not going up. And in fact, it's saving lives. It's saving lives of the people who are incarcerated. It's saving the lives of their family members, their community members, because it's stopping the spread of this virus. So one note, I guess I just want to make sure that everybody pays attention to is, when you have an official saying, nope, we have to do this tough on crime thing for everyone's safety, to really question that and ask them, why do you think that? Where's your evidence to back that up? Because I think you will often find there's no one behind that curtain. That's an Oz moment where you realize there's no basis for the sentence that someone was given originally. If someone had asked, why would Alice ever get a life sentence? Did someone do a computation to ask what the risk was, what she merited for what she did? There's no calculation that yields a life sentence in that scenario. That's just craziness. And yet we see these officials clinging to the sentences people had been given as if they're magic numbers that have anything behind them. I know Mark recently gave an interview that I really liked where he pointed out it's kind of like when Vogue magazine or those magazines have like the top 100 looks for spring, and you ask, like, why 100? Could there be 200? Could there be 50? It's just an arbitrary number. And he said that's what our sentencing numbers are as well. And he's 100% right. And yet we have governors, prosecutors, corrections officers saying, nope, those numbers, we have to stick to those. So we have people in New York who would be out and, their sentence is due to expire in 3 months from now. And they are not getting out because people are insisting they serve those last 3 months during a pandemic with a deadly virus. We have a governor who tries to claim to be progressive Democrat. I know a lot of people love seeing his, in my own family, they're bragging about how comforting they find him. And I'll tell you how I speak out. I say, he's not comforting. He's ignoring all the people in prisons in New York State. He's done nothing. He hasn't granted a single commutation. He doesn't really care, because if he cared, he'd care about them too. So I guess I'll leave you with just the takeaway of, please question people when they're telling you about public safety, and really make sure they are backing that up with real data and real empirical information. Secondly, just to echo what Alice and Mark have already said, I do think we need to use our voices now to speak out for those folks in whatever capacity that is, if it's to friends, if it's to relatives, if it's to your representatives, and just let them know this is a catastrophe in our nation's prisons and jails. It's absolutely horrific. In New York, we have 1,600 people that we know of who've tested positive among the staff and the people incarcerated. At least 8 people have died, and our governor has done nothing. So basically, anytime anyone talks to me about anything, I bring it up because I think it's important for people to know. It should be part of the report card of any public official right now as we evaluate them. What are they doing for those among us who depend on the state to protect them? Because no one is sentenced to die from a deadly virus. They are under the custody of the state, and the state has an obligation. We, our representatives, our state, we have an obligation to look after their health and safety. And unfortunately, we're falling woefully, woefully short. And the only other takeaway that I just would like to emphasize is, I think this is opening a window for some who aren't used to what goes on in our nation's prisons and jails. The conditions there are really poor, and they're not just poor because there's a virus right now. There are problems that have been deep-seated and really long-standing in our prisons, with inadequate programming, inadequate supplies for people, really mistreatment by the people who work there for the people who are incarcerated. There's all kinds of problems inside of our prisons and jails. And I'm also hoping this may be a moment where we really reflect on what we'd like to see going on there. Because these should be spaces where we're helping people and lifting them up and getting them ready when they're released on day one to succeed and to help others. And unfortunately, that is just not what most of the prisons and jails look like inside. And they're really quite neglectful of the people who are in them.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That's a powerful statement. True. Our present moment is a time of loss and lamentation. We do lament those who have died and those who are suffering. But as you point out, it is also a moment of opportunity. It's an opportunity for conscientization, to see things as they are and to mobilize for repair. We need, among other things, a new moral awakening that calls us to action. Mark, I wonder if you would share with us some of the ways that compassionate release has worked in other state settings to greater advantage than what we see happening or not happening in New York.
It varies very much from place to place, and we see it called different things. Compassionate release is a term of art in the federal system. Here in Minnesota, I can speak to personally because 6 weeks ago, which is an eternity ago in terms of the pandemic, I wrote a piece for the Star Tribune, the paper in Minneapolis, arguing that they need to thin out the prison population with an idea of how they could do that, which eventually they adopted. But so far, only 8 people have been released. And that is not going to solve the problem. That what we're running into in state after state and in the federal system is entrenched bureaucracies. And that what we need to focus on is changing those processes going forward in a number of ways. And the thing that's hard about that is that we often don't see and celebrate the successes when we make process changes, but they make a huge difference. And I'll give you an example. Rachel has probably saved 100 lives, because when she was a member of the Sentencing Commission, she pushed through a measure called drugs -2, where every narcotic sentence in the federal system was reduced by 2 offense level points. And that reduced and made it retroactive. And that reduced, I think it affected 40,000 federal sentences. And a lot of those people were released because of that change. And they didn't get COVID. And they didn't die. And they didn't suffer. And they weren't put on a ventilator. And that made a huge difference, because Rachel understood the problem with the process and made that change. And part of what we have to do when we look at things like compassionate release or medical release or clemency going forward is remember that we need to look to people with expertise and influence and power to change the systems that create the problems in the first place. And I think that's essential.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at some of the notes in the chat section, and I see one from Deborah Tyler to everyone. I hear stories of inmates due to be released who have no one to go to, no release plan, and I hear stories of others who have a plan who are not being released. Mark, we worked with Norman Brown at the Braxton Institute retreat that we had, and he described for us some of the challenges that people experience when they are released from prison. We learned a lot from Mr. Brown, and it did help raise our awareness, our consciousness. I wonder if, Alice, you might speak to that to some extent. Certainly you've had experience with your own case, which granted is not typical, but you must have known many other people who reintegrated after long terms in prison. What was that? What is that like, and how can we help? How can we increase our compassion in the case where there is such a compassion deficit and perhaps even willful ignorance in so many quarters?
Well, one thing is that when people come home from prison, these are just not felons who are being released. These are returning citizens. They're going to be your neighbors. They're going to be shopping with you. Some of them are going to be, their children will be in school with your children. There will be regular people on the streets. And there's not going to be a scarlet letter branded on them to tell you that these are ex-offenders. So what needs to happen is we've got to have better reentry systems in place so that when citizens return home from prison, they have the tools that are necessary, because we want to set them up for success and not set them up for failure. So we have to make sure that we got things in place. There are sometimes, and one thing that you just pointed out, and I want to go back to that, is that some of the people who were being released didn't really have good release plans. If you don't have a good release plan and you go to a halfway house, you're jumping from the skillet into the fire, because many of the halfway houses are overcrowded and you're going into something that's even bigger, a bigger situation. But then you have a lot of people who have families waiting for them, who have good release plans in place, and they're still locked up. They're not a safety risk, but we still choose to keep them there. And that is such a black mark on us as a nation, really, as a community. When people return home from prison, we each can do our part. We can welcome them back into our communities, and we can see what we can do to help them with their transition. They've already did their time. They've already paid the penalty for whatever they did. And it's not for us to continue to levy additional penalties upon them by ostracizing them and not allowing them to reintegrate back into communities. So
Nkechi Taifa still, is Nkechi Taifa still on the line?
Yes, I am, Dr. Braxton. I'm not sure if I'm muted or unmuted, but I'm here.
We can hear you.
We can
hear you.
We can hear you. Nkechi, do you have a question, a comment, or an observation? We're so grateful for your work in this area, for your leadership over a long period of time. What would you ask?
Well, the only thing I would say is I really appreciate the contributions of the panelists, you know, Mark and Rachel, and oh my goodness, of course, Miss Alice, you have been so helpful to us in Washington as we have been advocating before Congress to seek to do a number of things. Number one, protect the health and safety of those behind bars. Number two, to release as many people as possible so that the CDC guidelines can in fact be at least a modicum of reality inside of the institutions in terms of social distancing and the like. And then number three, what you all were just speaking of in terms of ensuring that there are appropriate reentry supports for people who are being released. There are far too few people being released, and what we need to do is continue to have the voices like we have here, to continue to have the celebrities such as Common, the rapper, who just came out with a hashtag We Matter Too campaign, Imagine Justice, to seek to bring his platform to this as well. And we need to really impress upon the powers that be to go on and do the right thing and ensure that people behind bars are seen as people and humans too, and to accord them the same scenarios that we are having here on the outside. So again, thank you all for everything that you are doing. You give us the fuel to keep working in Washington. Thank you,
Nkechi. Thank you for the work of the Justice Roundtable over a long period of time. And thank you for a great Vote for Justice program last night. And I'm looking forward to tonight as well. I'll be joining you.
Thank you.
I see some notes in the group chat about the role of faith organizations. This comes back to the point about the need for a moral awakening and for more compassion, to medicate that compassion deficit. Rachel, what role would you imagine that faith organizations might play, not by proselytizing, but by being moral and ethical citizens?
Yeah, I think amplifying the stories of the people we're talking about and putting a human face on this is something that I think, you know, lots of people can do, but certainly faith-based organizations. And you know, I'll kind of tie this back into the point that Mark made about sometimes there are these changes that you don't even kind of pay attention to because their process changes, but they make a big difference. And an example of that, and it goes to this point of what faith-based organizations can do, is, you know, they were really critical in supporting and telling the stories of people who had been incarcerated in federal prison, who had asked to get compassionate release. And basically everyone who ever applied to the Bureau of Prisons asking for compassionate release was either denied, or the Bureau of Prisons just never gave them an answer, even though they were dying. And so the Bureau would just not respond to their motion. And if you didn't have the Bureau of Prisons filing for you in court, you could never get out on compassionate release. And part of the First Step Act that Congress passed was the product of lots of reform organizations, including faith-based organizations, really kind of calling attention to that, you know, we need compassion in our system. You can't leave people to die. This system is broken. And so the act changed the process. So now, instead of having to get the Bureau of Prisons to file for you, people can go directly before a judge. And we are seeing all around the country, again, you're still supposed to go to the Bureau and give them 30 days, and they're still doing nothing. But now people can go to court right after that, and sometimes even get waivers for the 30 days. And judges around the country are granting these motions right now everywhere. You know, people who wouldn't have been out are getting out because of that change. And that law would not have happened but for the advocacy of these organizations and the religious community, faith-based organizations. You know, I think they're also really great places to bring together people on the left and the right. You know, this isn't a Democratic, Republican kind of line. It's just, you know, people who are of faith, who believe in forgiveness, who believe in redemption, who believe in humanity and second chances. You know, that just doesn't know political identification. And I think when those groups and people of those groups go to talk to politicians, they recognize that, you know, they recognize this isn't kind of the traditional Republican lobbyists. This isn't the traditional Democratic lobbyists. These are just good people trying to help other people. And those voices, I think, really, really matter. And not just in the political sphere. I think it also just matters when you're talking to your neighbors and your friends and you're saying, you know, I care about these people. And so you should too. And you should take, you know, I think it goes to Alice's point about those acts of kindness that she just does because she's a good, wonderful person. And it just leaves a mark on people as they're going forward. I think when people of faith, people that are good people, talk about the things that they care about, other people listen because they know, you know, these are people, they're not in it for the money. They're not in it because they're getting something out of it. They're just in because they care. This is what it means to be a basic human being and care and love our neighbors. And so people who advocate for people in prison from that platform, I think have the most powerful voice of all, you know, because it's not a financial stake. It's not a careerist kind of thing. It's really just being a good person. So I think it's, you know, anything that you can do to raise these issues, whether it's in the political sphere or just among the people that you know, to educate them about how important it is. And then the last thing I'll just say is if you have the opportunity to work inside, to visit, or in any way get closer to the people in prisons, I highly recommend that you do it. It's not just wonderful for the people inside. It'll be pretty life-changing for you. It's a very meaningful thing to do.
I love that comment. It's been meaningful for me to go to jail and prison. And I've always thought and always said, knowing members of my own family who were incarcerated, that some of the best minds of the race were incarcerated. I see a question about language is really important. How do we use our voices, our language, to tell this story and frame the situation in order to move more people to advocate for releasing incarcerated people? And also, what are the words and language not to use? For example, returning citizen. Yes. Formerly incarcerated person, I would assume no. But for those of you who are knowledgeable in these closing moments, please give us a word for how we might help advance this story without reinscribing some of the harm.
Well, I'll go first, but then I think Alice is the one that I would defer to on this. But, you know, even when we use the phrase formerly incarcerated person, we're saying person and not felon or inmate or something like that. And that's really the core of it, is whatever language we use, it needs to be informed by the inherent human dignity that everyone has, the light of God that's in all of us, no matter what they've done. They are brothers and sisters, and that's at the heart of it. But Alice, I think you can explain better than I ever could.
Absolutely. I think we should not refer as inmates, as a former inmate. I love the word, just say sisters and brothers, daughters and sons, because that humanizes them. That humanizes us as people. We're all sons and daughters. Not always all sisters and brothers physically, but spiritually, sisters and brothers. And when you phrase it like that, it brings something closer to your heart. You think about your own family. You're not thinking about someone who is distant. So I think that just making sure that we humanize, we continue to, as Mark said, even saying a formerly incarcerated person, you're still identifying them as a person and not as an object or as a thing.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being with us for this important community dialogue on resisting and thriving. I'd like to lift up Vote for Justice tonight. See the note from Nkechi in your Zoom chat. And I'd also like to thank you on behalf of the Braxton Institute for Sustainability, Resiliency, and Joy. Please check our website for the next dialogue webinar, which will be about the needs of clinicians who are from at-risk communities and also serving at-risk communities during this pandemic. What does it mean to be a caregiver, a doctor, a nurse, a respiratory therapist, someone who's cooking in a situation like this, a caregiver? What does it mean when you come from the at-risk community and you're in the midst of it and you're still receiving all of the assaults of bias that we know that do continue to re-inscribe harm? And that program will be framed by two Black women physicians born in East Africa, one who is a very dear friend of mine, and we're very much looking forward to it. For now, I want to say peace and blessings to everyone who is here, with a special thanks to our panelists today, Mark Osler, Rachel Barkow, Alice Marie Johnson, and let's thank our producer, the incredible Rochelle Faithful, also a Braxton Institute board member who has helped put this whole thing together while I'm in social isolation in Williamsburg, Virginia, working from the hotspot on my phone, since this is not my usual residence. And now, go in peace. May the spirit of love surround you everywhere you go. Until we meet again.